So, good evening. Provost of Worcester College, President of the Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2026 Massada Annual Lecture. I'm Naomi Rakotnitz, and I'm Director of the Israel and Ioni Massada Fellowships Program, which was established in 2017 with the generous support of the late Sheila Storm Kelly in memory of her parents, Israel and Ioni Massada. The aim of the program is to establish academic interchange and research partnerships between scholars here at the University of Oxford and scholars of all disciplines, ethnicities, and religions in the State of Israel. In addition to our visiting scholar fellowships, we sponsor a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship known as the Massada JRF, some graduate scholarships, and a range of special events that aim to explore avenues for advancing peaceful existence in the Middle East. The Massada Annual Lecture is held in association with the Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. In 2023, we hosted the author David Grossman. In 2024, the journalist Ilana Dayan. In 2025, the Arab-Israeli neuroscientist and rector of Haifa University, Muna Maroon. And today, we are honored to be hosting historian, public intellectual, and peace activist, Fania Oz-Salzberger. Before I introduce Fania, 2 notices and some thank yous. In the event of an emergency, or should the alarm go off, we will need to evacuate the building. The doors behind you are currently open, but should they close, they just push open, and the glass doors at the end of the foyer just push open. We will exit and assemble on the playing fields and wait for further instructions. Notice 2 is to remind you that when you signed up to attend this event, you agreed to comply with the Freedom of Speech Code of Conduct adopted by a number of colleges here at the University of Oxford, by which we aim to ensure that our speakers deliver their talks without interruption, and everyone present may ask questions during the Q&A, so long as this is done in a respectful manner. Additionally, we remind you that there will be no use of phones and no unauthorized recording or photography, so that this area remains a safe space for all involved. So I'd like to take a few more moments to say thank you to some of you. Thank you to Worcester College, and especially our provost, Lord Isaac, and to members of the Massada Committee, Professor Tzili Dagan and Konrad Laser. Thanks to Judith Schlanger, Professor and President of the Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, for continuous collaboration with the Massada program. Thanks to Hama Hindabal, our domestic bursar, to Craig Townsend and the Porters team, and to Paula Wallbridge and the events team for all the help behind the scenes today. Thanks to Nathan Stasica for the posters and comms, and to Chris for the tech. Thanks to all of you for coming here today, and to all those who seek to further understanding, cooperation, dignity, and peace for all people. Finally, thanks to our speaker for her valiant efforts to promote these values at the present time. So, to introduce her. Fania Oz-Salzberger is an Israeli historian specializing in the European Enlightenment and history of political thought. She took her DPhil degree here at Oxford at Lincoln College, supervised by Dr. John Robertson and mentored by the renowned philosopher Isaiah Berlin. She was then the first Honig Junior Research Fellow in Intellectual History at Wolfson College. Now, Professor Emerita of the University of Haifa School of Law and the Haifa Center for German and European Studies, she holds an honorary doctorate from Uppsala University, and in 2021 was awarded the DAAD Grimm Prize, by which the German government honors scholars from outside Germany who have made outstanding contributions to German studies. She's authored numerous books and articles, including Jews and Words, co-authored with her late father, Amos Oz. She's held visiting fellowships in Europe, Australia, and the United States, including as guest professor for distinguished teaching at Princeton University. She was joint editor-in-chief of the Haifa University Press for many years, and since 2003 is director of the Posen Research Forum for Jewish, European, and Israeli Political Thought. During Israel's pro-democracy protests, and especially since October 7th, 2023, she's devoted her time to calling for moderation and to advocating from every platform for peace between the river and the sea through securing two states, a sovereign Israel alongside a sovereign Palestine. To that end, she's written many opinion articles in major newspapers and journals in both the Israeli and the international press, and has contributed tirelessly to media panels, interviews, debates, and also some high-profile social media exchanges. Today, her talk will last approximately 45 minutes. Then we'll have time for questions and discussion, and then you are all invited to continue the conversation over drinks of your choice. So, to learn about how we might square the circle of peace, please welcome Fania Oz-Salzberger.
Thank you so much. I hope you can see some of me. Thank you so much, Nomi Rokotnitz. I thank the Massada program team. Thanks so much the provost and fellows of Worcester College for having me here and for this kind, albeit tricky, invitation to speak today. I would like to begin on a personal note. This is not an ordinary lecture, and it cannot be, because the time is not an ordinary time. I am an Israeli born and raised in what used to be called the Israeli peace camp. And two recent disasters have wreaked havoc in my country, on my country's place in the world, my personal life story, and part of my soul. The 7th of October Hamas massacre in southern Israel, and the ensuing Israeli-Hamas war in Gaza are not only the most influential events in my public life, in my life as a citizen, a public and academic voice, they are also major calamities in my private, in my personal life. So I speak here with a sense of grief, not only for the murdered people I knew, not only for the many innocents in Israel and the vast number of innocents killed in Gaza, whom I didn't know. I understand that my country, even if it survives and thrives, will carry a historical burden, a mark of guilt. But I cannot even be sure that Israel will survive and thrive. So I'm not standing here merely as an observer and an analyst. I have great fear for my home, my sense of belonging, and the future of my identity and my family. This is not the best time to be alive as an Israeli. And to be young, like my sons and their friends, is certainly not heaven. Far more challenging than that. And yet it is the young people who inspire our ongoing struggle for healing both Israel and Palestine. As things stand today, in the run-up to the Israeli elections, we still have a toolbox to employ in the horizon of hope. I still believe that Israeli society can yet rise and mend its governmental and media instruments. Such mending, in turn, can reopen the road to negotiating for a compromise and eventually perhaps for peace, next door to a peaceful Palestine. Several political parties running to the Knesset, including the Arab parties and the mainly Jewish Democrats Party, are openly speaking of peace and the two-states solution. A very recent poll has almost 20% of Israeli Jews in favor of a two-states solution. That is positively surprising. And about 45% of us would agree to a geopolitical separation of Israelis and Palestinians. This is also where most components of organized civil society stand. Therefore, I still hope that my family will remain living in Israel and speaking Hebrew for generations to come. I see it as a civic duty to speak out as long as there is tangible political hope. John Stuart Mill added that the impact of opinion is always a matter of opinion. This recent opinion poll has encouraged me somewhat. Now, this is not facile optimism. Israelis' opinions of peace with Egypt changed literally overnight when the late Anwar Sadat paid his sudden visit to Prime Minister Menachem Begin. I need to make one preliminary point about the failures of global conversation. Despite, or perhaps because of the internet and the world it has created, most Israelis, even today, are not aware of the extent of the calamity that has befallen us. They are so trapped in a one-dimensional reality, partially created by the Israeli government and its media, that they strongly assert that Israel is a blameless victim only. They curl up in the fetal position of bottomless victimhood, startlingly like the Palestinian position in some respects. This dissonance pains and angers me more than I can express, but my anger is not aimed at traumatized citizens, Israeli or Palestinian. Certainly not at my friends and colleagues who were barbarically bereaved by Hamas terrorists on the 7th of October. My anger is directed at the manipulators from above and the digital influencers who obscure the humanity of the enemy's civilians. The same leaders and demagogues who cry wolf or shout anti-Semitism whenever a true friend of Israel offers a scathing critique of its government's policy. I hardly need to remind the present audience that anti-Semitism is real, partly age-old, partly new and newly resurgent, and that its hands-on violence is rising in the wake of its verbal tide. Yet, instead of a staunch solidarity with Jewish communities worldwide, my government is undermining liberal opposition to anti-Semitism by smearing true friends and genuine allies and recasting legitimate criticism as anti-Semitic. At the same time, backhandedly, outspoken anti-Semites are sometimes hailed as pro-Israel, even though they are ultra-nationalists, the epitome of false friends. The good news is that numerous Israeli citizens on the majority spectrum of left to moderate right see the coming elections as an opportunity to mend what is broken, heal what is very sick, create a better climate for redemocratizing Israel. Some of this political spectrum, not all, is committed to reopening negotiations with the Palestinians. But all this spectrum is opposed to the current governmental corruption, to the illegal violence of soldiers and West Bank settlers, and the takeover of police, border guard, and prison service by a convicted racist minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, nurtured by Netanyahu to support his rogue coalition. I'm not using these words easily. I'm heartbroken to have to say them. I will make three arguments today. First, that the idea of a zero-sum conflict between Israel and Palestine is false. Second, that we must distinguish between historical and present forms of anti-Zionism. Third, that peace, however imperfect, must take precedence over absolutist notions of justice. I will also argue for the reinstatement of pragmatism and erstwhile Zionist value that was thrown to the wind. This talk is dedicated to the beloved memory of two men who first met each other here in Oxford in 1969, and I was fortunate enough to witness that meeting, although I was only 8 years old. Sir Isaiah Berlin and my father, Amos Oz, both of blessed memory. I am grateful that they are not alive to witness the current calamity. In my secular way, I think that maybe their ghosts might be hovering in this room, if it's not too hot for them. And I know that their ghosts cannot yet rest in peace. I recall their lifelong insistence on searching for a humanist thread in the wilderness and ugliness of history and working against the grain of Kant's and Isaiah's crooked timber of humanity. It was in one of their conversations here in Oxford, sometime in the 1980s, when I was a doctoral student here, that I heard my father say that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a clash of justice against justice. As such, he said, it is the ultimate Greek tragedy in the accurate sense that Sophocles and Euripides intended. The idea of conflicting claims to justice is currently drowned in the noise of a pro-Palestinian, or maybe so-called pro-Palestinian political theology of demons and angels, conquerors and conquered, northern and southern hemispheres, wicked colonialists and innocent victims, evil and righteous. This political theology posits my four grandparents as entitled European settlers who descended on Palestinian land and stole it. At its rather common extreme, this political theology also embraces Hamas and Hezbollah by asserting that sadistic murder is a fair punishment for alleged land theft. My grandparents' life story, I'm told, has been cancelled by academics, by intellectuals, by politicians, by journalists, and by media influencers. Zionism, here I'm uttering the Z word, a stance which my great-uncle Joseph Klausner saw as a modern compound of Judaism and humanism, this Zionism has been cancelled too. I often read on the social media that there is no such thing as a liberal Zionist, let alone a humanist one, because that would be a contradiction in terms, a logical chimera. Well, I'm speaking here today because I think that I do exist. But it is up to you to decide. So yes, I will utter the near ostracized words liberal Zionism, which is what both Berlin and Oz were to the end of their days. Consider Isaiah Berlin's classical distinction between benign and malign national movements. To the end of his days, he saw core Zionism as a moderate national creed. That would be my granddaughter. As a moderate national creed. And in the last decade of his life, although in the last decade of his life he warned against the rise of the malignant Israeli nationalism and ideology of racist superiority and denial of the Palestinians' equal claim to a nation state. To make it crystal clear, Berlin and Oz, and the line of moderate Zionist thinkers before them, established even earlier than Theodor Herzl, understood the Jewish claim to national independence to be equal to every other nation's claim to national independence. Herzl lived too early to become aware of the Palestinian claim, but Berlin and Oz accepted it as equally just. Core Zionism was about normalcy for the Jews among all other nations. Jewish superiority is by no means intrinsic to Zionism. That's though the idea of a light unto the nation is. Light unto the nations, yes. Some kind of a serving sovereign nation, yes. Superiority, no. To the deniers of liberal or humanist Zionism, I reply that almost every peace negotiation ever undertaken during this conflict was between moderate Palestinians and liberal Zionists. From here, I wish to salute my Palestinian interlocutors, Ahmed Fouad El-Khatib, Samer Sinjlawi, I think he visited here not long ago, Aziz Abu Sara, two good friends in Germany who may not wish to be named yet, and several others who have come under extreme hate and vitriol for their public endorsement of a future for both Palestinians and Israelis. I will also mention it's not an ordinary time or lecture, but it's also not an ordinary climate in this part of the world. I will also mention the large group of dozens of West Bank Palestinians currently attending a series of meetings in Europe with members of the Israeli opposition. This initiative is still under the radar, but it's ongoing, and we, moderates, Israelis and Palestinians, are each other's rock as we navigate the acrimony leveled against us. If these peace partners are accepting me, I shall not denounce my self-description, my ideological identity, a liberal Democrat first, a humanist Zionist second. From this personal and intellectual inheritance, I now turn to my first argument, and this is about squaring the circle, except that the circle is fake. I'm here to challenge the false dichotomy between pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. The idea that Israel and Palestine form a zero-sum game or a zero-sum conflict, that once people gain must be the other's destruction, is both intellectually flawed and politically dangerous. It traps us in the demonic logic of total victory versus total defeat. Human reality is less tidy. The crooked timber of humanity, Immanuel Kant's phrase, so beautifully varnished by Isaiah Berlin, does not yield perfect symmetry. We cannot undo past catastrophes, but we can shape what follows them. Societies like people can endure, adapt, and even heal, though never without scars. Like humans and societies, all trees carry their scars even as they heal and grow. I would like to make it clear where I come from. I am the grandchild of Jews of European and partly Sephardic descent who arrived in the port of Jaffa with a migration certificate granted by the British Mandate Government of Palestine around the mid-1930s. While not all four of them were avid Zionists, This, for all four of them, was the only ticket out of Eastern Europe at that late stage prior to September 1939. Every single relative who remained in place, including those who desperately tried to get visas to other countries, were rounded up and shot or gassed by the Wehrmacht and by the SS, so that by 1942, as far as we know, we had no living relatives in Europe. Family. I'm also a historian of ideas. My doctoral thesis, written in this university, is about the Enlightenment. It took me years to understand how intimately my chosen topic ties with my own family history. The Enlightenment, especially the German Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, inspired the pioneers of the Jewish Haskalah, which in turn kindled the Zionist idea. Of course, the Haskalah also kindled non-Zionist and anti-Zionist ideologies among the large and culturally awakening Jewish population of East Europe in the late 19th century. But the Haskalah gradually lent greater support to the Zionist idea because its pan-European humanist dream was being continually slapped and jeered by a modernized European anti-Semitism. As my grandfather Aryeh used to say, when I was a child in Europe, the graffiti on the walls screamed at us Jews go to Palestine. But now that I travel from Israel to Europe, the graffiti tells me Jews get out of Palestine. Times have changed indeed. Let me lay down a simple fact. The Zionist idea of my family did not involve the displacement of a single Palestinian, and it saved the lives of all four of them. There were migration in the 1930s, and I'm not forgetting also to thank the victorious British campaign in Northern Africa during the Second World War, were the only acts that prevented the Wehrmacht and the SS from killing both my parents in their earliest infancy. To be sure, those grandparents also believed in a state for the Jews and all its citizens, in our ancient claim to the land and in building a just community, a country, a kibbutz. But their strongest reason to migrate was not ideology. It was life. The naked fact that multitudes survived only thanks to Zionism does not compel me to be a Zionist myself. It does not force upon me any specific historical narrative or national story, but it does compel me to try to be honest. Some of my fellow Israeli-born historians have come to the moral conclusion that Zionism should never have happened and that Israel's very existence is therefore unjustified. Perhaps their biographies are different. Perhaps their families had more options. Perhaps they are better historians or better human beings, more detached than I am, able to treat the fact of their own existence as morally irrelevant. I respect their positions, but I cannot follow them. I cannot regard my grandparents' survival and my own birth as an incidental footnote to a theoretical argument. Zionism saved their lives. It provided the only space in which I could have been born, and I refuse to trivialize this fact. The Palestinian sense of belonging to their ancestral land deserves similar respect, no matter how much we argue about the historical details. No one is going away, neither the Israeli Jews nor the Palestinians. I wish world leaders, not to mention my own government, had done more to proclaim this simple starting point. Instead, the zero-sum game monstrosities are on the march, river to sea, by any means necessary, erase Gaza, kill Israel. It is a world of false friends preaching ever more bloodshed. During the last decades of his life, my father used to tell his audiences humorously, I am not pro-Israel, I'm not pro-Palestine, I am pro-peace. My title today deliberately paraphrases him because, as Isaiah Berlin taught us both, you are allowed to paraphrase dead thinkers for their own good. Amos Oz was most certainly pro-Israel and pro-Palestine in his own ways. He was ardently, emotionally engaged with the state of Israel. He was ever in love with the Hebrew culture, with the modern Hebrew language, with the literature. He was also one of the first Israelis of his generation to support a Palestinian state next door to Israel, between the river and the sea. This was his idea of compromise, which in his vocabulary is a good term. This was his idea of peace, which in his vocabulary meant that both nations get to survive and prosper, not by uniting, but by dividing and sharing. Why not one state? Why can't the Jews and Arabs, Palestinians, live as one happy family? Well, first of all, of course, within Israel, we have almost 20% of Israeli Arab, Israeli Palestinian, and Jews and other citizens. So we do live together quite happily, not perfectly. But why not a united Israel-Palestine between the river and the sea? Because, my father used to say, we are not one, we are not happy, and we are not a family. If you want peace in the Middle East, he would say, help us to divorce amicably and split our tiny homeland into two. I was 7 years old when the Six-Day War erupted, and I was 17 years old when I sat on the rug in my parents' tiny kibbutz apartment and witnessed the foundation of the Peace Now movement. I was there when my father conducted dialogues with Palestinian intellectuals, most notably Sari Nusseibeh, and when he joined the Oslo negotiation team to help them hammer the precious idea of a territorial compromise into words. So I'm literally a child of the two-state solution. What a growing number of Israelis understand today, and Berlin and Oz understood more than 50 years ago, is that the rising movement of Jewish nationalists settling the West Bank, and previously, and also planning in the future to resettle Gaza, is not hyper-Zionist, but anti-Zionist, undermining the core of justification for a state for the Jews within the land of Israel. Which brings me to a different kind of problem, not political reality, but language, the language we use to describe it. Let us talk about the death of words and concepts. There are many semantic death notices these days, and perhaps we need new philosophies of language to tackle them. As it happens, concepts, ideas, and terminology do not die just because you want them to die or think they are finished, historically kaput, theoretically insufferable. Since the 7th of October 23, people assert, for example, that the two-state solution is dead. Some say it in sorrow, others in glee. I'm here to contest this claim. Other people, including liberal Jewish intellectuals whom I esteem, tell me that the word Zionism is dead and ought to be buried as quickly as possible because, to put it briefly, internet influencers have managed to persuade most of digitized humankind that Zionist equals Nazi. My friends are rightly worried that I might be carrying the dead burden of a disgraced keywords. But no, the word and the phenomenon of Zionism is not dead. Concepts and vocabularies do not die so fast. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that a huge majority among Israel's current 7 million, a little more than 7 million Jewish citizens call themselves Zionism, including a surprising and growing share of the ultra-Orthodox. Many of them have a fervent belief in the truth and justice of their own historical narrative. This sense of self is currently pitted against millions of Palestinians and friends of the Palestinians, and self-declared friends of the Palestinians, including a powerful array of academic scholars, public intellectuals. Two grandiloquent, one-sided convictions that can only play a blood-soaked zero-sum game. How exactly would you un-Zionize the Israeli side? We used to say that Yiddish is a dialect and Hebrew is a language because Hebrew has an army and Yiddish does not. Well, in the crudest sense, beyond any moral or historical justification, Zionism is an ideology with an atom bomb. Its people will not heed critical theory and will resist brute force, even if resistance makes them more brutal. Nor can the Palestinian national movement be undone by brute force, as we have learned to our detriment. Zionism, its essence, the Herzl Creed, has a very tight core. Everything around that core is either dispensable add-ons or an obnoxious distortion, a kind of cancer that you can sometimes see in the history of ideas clinging to a basic concept. I will never tire of repeating the Herzl formula because I'm still willing to defend it with my life. It is that Jewish people have a right to a nation state within their ancestral homeland. This is the core, and for Herzl, one more item belonged to this core, that the nation state of the Jews is a liberal democracy, i.e., a country with equal civil rights for its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens. Israel's Declaration of Independence of 1948 puts it succinctly. The state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. This is an enormous part of the foundational DNA of the Zionist movement. This is why every anti-democratic and anti-civil egalitarian policy of previous and especially the current government of Israel is essentially anti-Zionist. So let me bring you some news from the Holy Land. The inner conversation in Israel, yesterday and today too, is not about demolishing Zionism, but about the roaring abyss that has opened between Herzl's and the Declaration of Independence Zionism and the so-called Netanyahu and Ben Gvir Zionism. The latter may well be defeated in the coming elections, but the former is not going to die so quickly, no matter how many post-colonialist university professors and their students are killing it off conceptually. Let me put it another way. The state of Israel exists, and if its existence were not in doubt, there would be no Zionism. No other nation state that I know has a similar up-and-running ideology defending its existence, for the simple reason that its existence is behind doubt. As long as 7 million Israeli Jews are in the fetal position of existential fear for their country, for their lives, they will use the term Zionism. It will only go away, and happy be the moment when both Israelis and Palestinians have a secure national home within their ancestral homeland. two states, or a creative confederacy. I'm open to ideas. Now, I'd like to address two concepts of anti-Zionism, or two different clusters of anti-Zionism, and the difference is primarily temporal. The first is historical anti-Zionism, which has always been both legitimate and widespread. In the early 20th century in Eastern Europe, many Jews rejected Zionism for principled reasons, some for religious beliefs, others for socialist or cosmopolitan ideals. For them, the question was whether Jews should seek sovereignty at all, and their answer was no. History did not treat those alternatives equally. Many who rejected Zionism were destroyed by the catastrophe that followed, by the Holocaust, while those who migrated survived, whether they migrated to mandatory Palestine or to Australia or to the Americas. In my own family, survival came through migration, and from this emerged the life raft justification, Zionism as a life raft, not primarily a destiny or an ideology, but a refuge. The second form of anti-Zionism is present-day anti-Zionism, which addresses a different question altogether, not whether Zionism should have happened, but whether Israel should continue to exist. This distinction matters. To debate Zionism before 1947 is to debate a possibility. To reject Israel today is to confront an existing reality, millions of people, with a state, a society, and nowhere else to go. Blurring these two anti-Zionisms, whether out of intellectual laziness or at times manipulative dishonesty, is not only analytically weak, it obscures what is morally at stake in the present, the viability of a bloodless solution for both Palestinians and Jews. Whenever a quality newspaper like the New York Times or The Guardian reports on the clash between pro-Palestinians and pro-Israelis, I feel cheated. This is almost invariably a misleading, at times manipulative oversimplification. You cannot refer to pro-Palestinian protesters without asking what sort of Palestine are they pro? You cannot speak of pro-Israeli demonstrators without asking what sort of Israel are they pro? As I've argued, Israel and Palestine are not a zero-sum game. But if so, what the hell is pro-Palestinian about the open wish to destroy Israel? No genocidal wish against the Jews is pro-Palestinian. Equally obnoxious in my mind is the stance that it is pro-Israeli to wish the Palestinians off the map, to see them subdued or ethnically cleansed. No genocidal wish against the Palestinians is pro-Israeli. And the world today is full of false friends. Many are trying to square the circle by wishing for a one-state solution, the one happy family solution. And here is my turn to use the sad phrase, not after the 7th of October, not in my lifetime. Perhaps not in my children's lifetime, but who knows? There will be no co-citizenship today or tomorrow of Nukba militants from Gaza and kibbutz grannies. From a Gazan perspective, I will totally understand if people tell me that there will be no co-citizenship of bombed, bereaved, and evacuated Gazan civilians with the IDF soldiers who at time committed war crimes against them. This is no time for marriage, a happy ever after, perhaps after, long way after. I don't want well-meaning people to give up the one-state dream. All I'm saying is that it cannot happen in this or the next generation. The two states can happen. They are not my pipe dream, they are not my messianic utopia, and they are not total justice, but they are a practical horizon for coexistence and a life raft for both nations. Which brings me to my final point, the issue of justice and peace. We are so used to seeing these terms twinned in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Justice and peace will kiss, says the book of Psalms. But in the world today, peace has been dropped, at least among many members of the left, dropped from their political vocabularies, except for the Israeli left, which is working very hard for peace. I must add that there is also an ultra-nationalist, Jewish racist use of shalom among would-be settlers of Gaza and ethnic cleansers of the West Bank. Their peace is a piece of the graveyard of Jewish superiority and the lunatic dream of the vanishing of the Palestinians. But most of these voices do not mention peace at all, as is the case with most public statements of the global pro-Palestinian voice. Greatest exception, precious exception, are the Israeli Arab citizens or Israeli Palestinians, political leaders including Mansour Abbas and Ayman Odeh, Youssef Jabarin, who are openly talking about peace in the context of the two-state solution, and more broadly, offer a far better level of community and cohesion among Israeli Jews and Arabs. Other groups are promoting more original ideas, such as one frame of statehood for two free and independent nations. All original ideas are very welcome. On the other hand, the term justice has moved decisively to the Palestinian corner of what I've called the zero-sum game. It is often a polite euphemism for outcomes that can only be accomplished violently, with the word resistance in place as a polite euphemism for violence. It is about ethnic cleansing of the Jews, as in go back to Poland, and the far stupider go back to Germany, which I get in average twice a day on Twitter. Such a concept of justice is either anti-peace or it points towards the peace of the graveyard I have mentioned before, because it assumes that the Jews who founded Israel had no justice on their side whatsoever. This revoking or cancellation of the Jewish Zionist claim to justice is perfectly corroborated by post-colonialist theory. Which is why I humbly suggest that post-colonial theory may not be the only useful paradigm. No matter how popular its explicatory power might be, it does not fully cover the truth as I and some of you know it. So I still root for my father's legacy on this point, the theory of tragically conflicting justices that need to be reconciled by compromise. There are two kinds of tragedies, my father used to say, the Shakespearean and the Chekhovian. In Shakespeare tragedies, at the end of the play, the stage is strewn with bodies and an abstract whiff of justice, total justice, hangs in the rancid air. In the the Chekhovian tragedy, the final scene has everyone hurt, disappointed, disillusioned, unhappy, not going to Moscow after all, but alive. But alive. I want a Chekhovian ending. I opened my conclusion with that wonderful Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. In the place where we are right, or just, said Amichai, no flowers will grow. For my part, I recommend unjust peace over unpeaceful justice. I therefore want to remind you a long-forgotten feature of core Zionism. Herzl's vision was intensely futuristic and utopian, replete with love and trust of modernity, technology, and rationalism. Other Zionists were more realistic, but precisely their realism gave rise to another lost virtue of the early movement, so well displayed by Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion: pragmatism. They put a tremendous weight on diplomacy, an enormous emphasis on legality. The Balfour Declaration and later the United Nations Resolution 181 of November 1947 were their holy grail, the Jews' longed for entry ticket into the international community. Israel's recent governments have been overriding and squandering the early Zionist values of realism, pragmatism, and moderation. They have not only rejected the Herzlian commitment to liberal democracy, just like the fanatic defenders of the Second Temple in the 1st century AD, they threw raison d'être out of the window. Worse, they rooted out every remnant of humanism that early Zionism embraced. Herzl's dream of making the world a better place for Jews, Arabs, and modern humankind in general. The coming elections in Israel are historically decisive. The reason why thousands of us are engaged with civil and political activism is precisely because we are still within the window of opportunity for re-democratizing Israel and returning, sad and sober and disillusioned as we are, to the process of peacemaking within secure and legally recognized borders for both Israel and Palestine. And to my grandchild, whom I can see just through that door, I say that the nation state is not holy. It is not our ancient legacy from times immemorial. It is a modern and deeply flawed political mechanism that will one day be replaced, hopefully by better governmental arrangements, regional or global. By then, Zionism and all other national statehood movements, including the Palestinians, will be relegated to the ashes of history, tragic and bloody and long gone. And justice and peace will perhaps again kiss, and flowers will grow. Until then, our task is to choose nuance over absolutism, life over purity, and compromise over despair. Thank you.
Thank you, Fania, for that very, very inspiring and moving ending. So we have time for questions. Please wait for me to reach you with the microphone.
Quick question about the role of the diaspora Jewish community worldwide. So Herzl thought that the creation of a Jewish homeland in Israel would end anti-Semitism in the world. Obviously it hasn't. And at the moment, things have got so intense. I'm very curious, because I really respect and hope that you're right in what you're trying to advocate for, but what do you see as the role of the diaspora Jews, and also how do we address the continual sort of framing of Israel as a genocidal state, and et cetera, where, you know, so I just wondered what your view of that is.
Yes. I'll say right away that I will not address a genocide question because I don't know yet. One day we will know. I can talk about a terrible, dirty, ugly war in Gaza. I can talk about war crimes on both sides. As to the so-called role of the diaspora Jews, I don't think that diaspora Jews ought to have a role at all unless they voluntarily wish to take part. And for me, and it's always been so, I think ever since I became aware of these issues, the world would have become far poorer if every Jew had gone to Israel. This is not the idea. This is not what Jewish intellectual diversity is about. Ideological diversity. I know that now some so-called pro-Palestinians are trying to weaponize Jewish diversity against us, but the point is that if you feel close at heart to Israel, first question is which Israel, and maybe then try to help the Israel that you are after. But first of all, we as Israelis have a duty towards diaspora Jews these days to acknowledge what you are going through, partially because of us, very much against the will of the liberal Democrats among us. So God bless you and take good care of yourself.
Thanks very much for your very moving talk, I agree. I think it follows directly from a question about the international or the Jewish diaspora. I want to ask about the international community and its role, and about the true friends of Israel as you've described them. And
yes.
One of the things that is very much on the table, partly as a result of recent events, including the flotilla, is, I think, greater focus on the harms caused by the settlement project and West Bank settlers. And one thing that the European Union, for instance, is considering is a ban on settlement products. On the assumption that this would further a two-state solution arrangement, given the one cannot be had at the current state, do you think those are moves that, say, the peace movement in Israel should be endorsing and supporting, with a hope that will lead to a two-state solution?
Yes. Well, I will answer in brief about the role of the friendly leaders in the international community. I've been talking to, especially to the Germans, quite a bit, and I even published a book in German last year calling for more hands-on intervention of European governments in what's happening, first of all, to Israeli democracy, and obviously also in the West Bank and in Gaza. Itamar Ben-Gvir has just been declared a persona non grata in several European countries. It should have happened years earlier. What we need is the toughest possible stance vis-à-vis, I'm sorry to say, my current government and leadership, especially in the areas where it is bordering on the criminals, such as the West Bank situation today, and at the same time to remain open-hearted to Israeli civil society. And almost the whole part of Israeli society that is a civil society is hoping for re-democratization and peace. So please discern, not between two Israels, I wouldn't call it two Israels, but please discern between extremely self-serving government ministers these days and civil society at large.
I'd like to ask something that follows on from that. When I first read some of your father's works, may his memory be a blessing, I have to confess I thought he was some kind of mystic. When he said the occupation corrupted, I wondered whether he thought that a Meretznik would cross the green line and suddenly the air would change what they think and they turn into a Kahanist. Yes. And I didn't realize that what he was talking about was building a society within a society that radicalizes both itself and the other elements of that society by co-opting them. So my question is, do you think that the struggle from within, your struggle, the struggle of many people I admire, can succeed without international help? Do you think you can do it by yourselves? Or has that painful moment come where we have to recognize that not only might international pressure help, but also it might even be a necessity?
Those of us who are very engaged with the current civic struggle, which was a struggle against the so-called judicial reform, which we call a coup d'etat from above, and the struggle for the hostages, the poor hostages, when the Netanyahu government post-7 October had other issues to deal with. And now back into the democracy issue and trying for the moderate right to left spectrum to win the coming elections. We are still hoping we can do it ourselves, with no foreign intervention beyond speaking out. If, God forbid, or heaven forbid, or after the next elections, we've realized we are still in a minority, other conclusions may have to be drawn. But so far we are building and banking on the common sense of ordinary Israeli citizens, not only the known lefties, people in the center right, to be able to heal our governmental system, starting with the coming elections. And I still hope so.
Thank you very much, Fania. Thank you very much, Fania. I have a question about how one generates positive dialogue. So there's research in social psychology which repeatedly finds that if you try and talk about the topics on which you disagree, you only continue to disagree. And the important point is to build on the places where you already agree, and that is exactly your moderate Palestinian and Israeli dialogue. So I wanted to know, where do you think are the forums in which that moderate dialogue can be expanded in order to slightly re-weight the sort of conversations we're having?
Well, if I understood the question correctly, the question is how far should I shed off part of what I stand for in order to reach out to the enemy or to my rivals. And, I've spent the last, I would say, 30-odd years meeting and talking with Palestinians and pro-Palestinians. And the balancing act, the name of the game, is to keep one's own identity and life story, even though it might change along the way or improve along the way, while reaching out for dialogue. So just as I would not expect a Palestinian interlocutor to tell me, oh, I'm not so strong on Palestinian nationalism. I do have such friends, but they're not the ones with whom I have to make peace. I cannot step forward and say, in fact, I'm just a kind of a global humanist, and I don't want to call myself Zionist, and so on. I cannot shed off that part of my story, of my past, and still offer a genuine proposition in a peace dialogue. And I think that there is even more mutual respect that way, as long as we are non-violent, as long as we are not fanatical, but speak our minds for what we are and what our ancestors were. It's not a typical liberal position, but it is my position.
I was wondering, if a different government is elected after the next elections...
I'm sorry, who is elected?
If a new government is elected,
yes.
What kind of steps do you think they could take to improve the situation?
What kind of? Sorry, I didn't get the last...
What could they do
yes.
To improve the situation?
Oh, there is so much to do to improve the situation. And we are also working on that. There are quite a few think tanks and people working with the Democrats Party and others who are laying the checklist for everything that has to be done and also undone, beginning with the violent hubs of settlers in the West Bank, beginning with the Israeli army that has gone through something very bad in recent years, in terms of its own moral code, by the way, its own written moral code. Continuing with some kind of a constitutional readjustment. Israel, of course, doesn't have a written constitution. We do have basic laws. We need to find legal ways, legislative ways, to far better defend the Israeli separation of powers, the judiciary, the independence of the judiciary, the media, the independence of the media. All of these proven flaws in our current legal situation. So there's a lot to be done in the Knesset, there's a lot to be done in the army, there's a lot to be done in the West Bank, and hopefully begin to prepare the floor for the table around which Israeli-Palestinian negotiations could begin again. Not following exactly the track of the Oslo process, but restarting this horizon. These are the most urgent roles, I think, of any decent elected government after the coming elections in Israel.
Thank you very much, Fania, for your immensely stimulating, intellectually compelling, and also very touching talk. You talked about the shortcomings or deficiencies of post-colonial theory as a kind of explanatory framework for the current conflict.
Yes.
And of course, you are addressing us within an august Oxford College, within an academic institution. And I wonder if you could perhaps say a few words what your expectations are of the Western academic world, especially authorities governing academic institutions in this respect.
Well, I would put it very simply, thank you for the question, Paulina, as I formerly did. I would expect any honest academic not to confuse between the question of the original justice of Zionist movement and the question of Israel's existence today. And too many academics confuse the two, sometimes deliberately, hinting, sometimes outspokenly saying, that Israel as such today should no longer exist. This is for me beyond the pale because it is not an academic observation. It is call for violence. Same goes for supporters of Hamas. And the 7th of October 23 within the Western academia. This is for me, to put it very gently, a deeply flawed academic stance, not to mention humanly and morally.
I remember that in the months after October the 7th, we had, talking with friends and family in Israel, a lot of Israelis denying that there was an upsurge in attacks on Jews in the wider Western world.
Yes.
Which has now reached, I think, a tipping point. I know that the majority are probably on our side. They're just not saying anything yet. I wish they would. But I know a lot of friends and family in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, in America who are extremely scared. They don't identify themselves. I got my shalom necklace on. I thought twice about wearing it, and that's in Oxford, which is probably one of the safest places in the UK to be as a Jew. How aware now is the wider Israeli society of how bad it is in diaspora and how much that is because people are using the Netanyahu government as an excuse to attack Jews?
Well, unfortunately, the Netanyahu government is weaponizing anti-Semitism in several different ways, but certainly in saying that every Israel critique is anti-Semitic, akin to the attacks we are looking, at British Jews today. It's happening on an almost daily level now. We in Israel are aware of that. I think a lot of people are still too emotionally exhausted and strained to speak out, to act, but they do feel it. And I find it extremely alarming that critical friendship is put by our leaders on the same level as these obnoxious anti-Semitic violent attacks. So I would really want to reach out and hug, if I may, every victim of anti-Semitism out there. I do not want my fellow Israelis to wallow in our own victimhood and righteousness, excluding the kind of criticism we need to hear. So this has to be disentangled and real anti-Semitism tackled as soon as possible by Israelis.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being at the forefront for many of us. I have a question that might be a bit tricky. What about religion?
What about?
Religion.
Religion.
In this story.
Mm-hmm. Which religion?
Exactly. That's exactly my question.
Moderate Islam, extreme Islam, messianic, hands-on nationalist Judaism, or there are conservative and reform currents which are now being assaulted by Israeli government ministers, God knows. I was brought up in one of those quintessentially secular Jewish spaces, a kibbutz. We had a lot of Judaism, but no religion, which is doable. My father and I actually co-authored a book about it titled Jews and Words. So I don't think that religion as such plays any role before we defined what religion we are talking about. And I don't just mean Islam versus Christianity versus Judaism. I mean the only distinction that truly matters: fanatic religiosity and moderate religiosity. And I'm happy as a secular to embrace moderate religiosity. I have no time for fanatic religiosity in the world today.
Fania, are we really describing a four-way civil war or a four-way conflict? That is, Israel seems, especially since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, to have been trembling on the edge of a civil war itself, then the Second Intifada, and so on. But at the moment, from reading the press every single day, Israel looks like it's almost hovering on the brink of civil war. Do you fear civic violence and meltdown, not between Jews and Arabs in Israel-Palestine, but inside the Israeli polity?
Well, George, thanks for the question. I would like to put it upside down on its positive head, which is that I find it's a miracle that Jews in Israel have not yet erupted into a civil war. Should have done long ago, compared to many other wonderful Western countries in this respect. We haven't, and I take that to be a point of pride, even though I cannot stand the extremists on the other side. And they cannot stand me, as has been often proven in the media. It might happen if we deteriorate further. I'm afraid that most Israeli liberal Democrats are not planning to take up arms and fight fellow Jews. They're planning to find ways to leave the country, and not everybody will be able to. So it's very hard to predict what happens if the extremism continues. But perhaps we can bank on the comforting fact that we haven't erupted into a warm civil war yet. There's a Cold War going on for decades already, as you know, but it's still a Cold War following the good old Jewish precept of translating violence into words. Very violent words these days, but words. I'm hoping we can continue to count on that legacy.
As a diaspora Jew, I see a contrast between many of us here and the Sabra, which you are, having a different outlook. I want to raise that in two ways. One is genocide. You didn't want to say whether there was genocide or not. Let me read you the legal definition. It is an act committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It's what the settlers in America did to the natives there. It's what the settlers in Australia did to the indigenous Australians, and so on. There is no way that even the killing, tragically, of 70,000 residents of Gaza adds up to genocide if you apply the legal definition. The word is used in order, we see, to undermine the Holocaust and the effect it had on Jews. The worst crime in the world is genocide. Genocide was what was committed against the Jews in the Second World War. If you can now say, oh, but the Jews are committing genocide, you wipe out some of that guilt. You make people feel better. There's a long root of that in anti-Semitism. And then very briefly, two-state solutions. Well, we've got it in Ireland, and they're still killing each other. Pakistan and India, Northern Cyprus and Cyprus. I'm not sure it works, especially if one side, their main concern is actually to overrun the other and take the whole of the place, not just their part. That is a diaspora and double standards point of view.
Thank you. Respectfully noted. There was no question therein, but I have noted and heard.
You were speaking before about the important difference for you between historical Zionism and...
Can you just put the microphone a little closer? Thank you.
You said a few times about the important for you to differentiate between historical Zionism and contemporary one, Likud, Netanyahu, whatever. But I feel uncomfortable because the reality of apartheid in the West Bank, the ongoing occupation, was the grounds for that were laid by Zionist parties from the old school of Zionism that you were mentioning. How do you...
Yes, well, this brings me, as you can guess, to the tragedy of Yitzhak Rabin. Also as an individual, but certainly as a twice Prime Minister of Israel, because during his first premiership in the 1970s, he was still part of this ongoing disaster of allowing the earliest trickles of Jewish settlements into the West Bank, thereby beginning to block the possibility of ending the occupation. During his second premiership, cut short by his assassination in the mid-90s, he was trying to undo that damage. He was trying to move on with the peace process, with the Oslo Accords. And his tragedy and ours was that this individual who might have changed history, because individuals sometimes do, was assassinated by another individual who did change history. So this is my brief answer. I think that the Israeli labor, left of center and center milieu was getting to a realization of how wrong this has been. The ongoing occupation, although there was a problem with the other side, but putting that aside for a minute, allowing the settlers in, and we're trying to undo the damage, and Rabin had a majority on his side, not only in the Knesset, but also in the Israeli public. And then this was assassinated.
Thank you for the talk, Fania. I wonder whether there's a sense in which you've been too optimistic and too flattering to Israeli society. The way you presented things was as if there is the government, including, of course, its support, and then there's the huge camp, the majority, that objects to the government. And it is, of course, true. So, for instance, in the happy days of the protests against the judicial overhaul and the coup d'etat before October 7th, it was clear that there was a majority in the population, at least for many of these protests. And it remains true that the Netanyahu government is not very popular. But when it comes to some of the issues that are more directly relevant to the things you were talking about, I just don't think it's true. So I think the problem runs much deeper of a kind of an ingrained racism. If you ask what proportion of the population in Israel were happy to sign on to such statements as there are no innocents in Gaza, you will reach well into what we used to think was our camp. And that's not something that an election is going to fix. I'm open to the possibility that such views are also influenced by circumstances, and we should try and engineer better circumstances so that they will change. But the problems go much deeper than the picture you seem to paint here. And I would imagine, although I know less about it, that something similar is true on the Palestinian side as well. There are problems of extremism. There are moderates, we all know and love them. But there are deeply rooted problems that are not fixed by merely the fixing of a horrible leadership or some fairly specific contingency?
Well, yes. Thank you. A good point. And as I said from the very beginning, this is not only about peace, this is about Israeli democracy. I'm not in a position to talk about Palestinian democracy, that's for the Palestinians, but Israeli democracy is hanging on the thread because there is such a deep rift within Israeli society. As I said before, it's a miracle that we haven't erupted into a civil war yet. And the real rift within Israeli society is whether the logic of history is Western, humanist, rationalist, or whether the logic of history or meta-history is messianic, in which case Israel doesn't need allies, Israel doesn't need democracy, Israel only needs its superiority in the Messiah, as we are told by the rabbis from the hills. My anger at my government, which is a real anger, and this is something that can be undone in the coming elections, is the fact that it has normalized the most extreme of the extremists. Normalized and thus given a green light to their fanatic disciples in the West Bank, within the army, I'm afraid, to run amok among Palestinians. Now, if this normalization can be undone, and I believe it still can, then there is a role for elections, there is a role for public debate, there is a role for getting back on the liberal democratic track, regardless of the messianists, and there are a few of those. I'm not saying that the majority of Israelis stand with me today, but I said before, 45% of respondents, Jewish Israelis, to the most recent poll are saying that they are willing for some kind of a territorial compromise and a border. Now, that may be out of racism. Okay, so let's deal with a territorial compromise in this generation and root out racism in the next generation. But we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, hello. Yes, yeah. So as we know today, there's a war with Iran going on, right? Even though the Gaza war is reduced, but the war with Iran is going on. And also today, Israel expanded its ground operation in Lebanon. So can you comment on the situation with Lebanon and Iran and how your peace movement, how you can bring peace to those situations?
Yes. I'll have to be very brief because this is slightly beyond my mandate. Today, in regard to Lebanon, the Hezbollah issue is very, very serious and has to be tackled, as does the Hamas issue in Gaza. Perhaps even by war, but not this kind of war, especially in Gaza, not this kind of war. Israel should be able to wage a just war against its dire enemies without it becoming an unjust war targeting civilians. This is true for Lebanon as it is for Gaza, but they do have to be tackled, both Hamas and Hezbollah. With regard to Iran, I can only say that my heart goes out to the ordinary Iranians that have now been all but forgotten, especially by their would-be savior from the White House. And I think mainly about them. I do not know how to undo this regional conundrum. I know that millions of good democratic Iranians are still there helplessly waiting for some kind of a change. And as an Israeli liberal democrat, my heart goes out to them.
We are out of time, with the hope that the moderates in every country, including the moderates in Iran who cannot voice their opinions because they would be executed, and the moderates in other countries where there is no democracy, and the moderates in Israel who are trying their best, we hope that we can establish some kind of dialogue and future for the grandchildren playing in the background. And I hope you'll join me in thanking Fania Oz-Salzberger for this very, very inspiring talk.